Some people spend their entire lives searching for love. Others meet it on the one night they swear they will never believe in it again. The first time I saw Adrian DeLuca, he was standing alone in the rain like a man who belonged to the storm instead of the world around him. I did not know his name. I did not know he was the heir to one of the most powerful families in Chicago. I certainly did not know that everyone who passed him chose to look away. They hurried across the sidewalk with umbrellas pulled low, pretending they did not notice the tall man dressed in an immaculate black suit standing beside a marble memorial in the city park. It was late October, and a cold wind carried bright orange leaves across the wet pavement. My shift at the elementary school had ended hours earlier, but I had stopped by the small neighborhood bakery to pick up fresh bread before walking home. The rain started unexpectedly, turning quiet streets into shimmering rivers beneath the glow of streetlights. I opened my umbrella and noticed him immediately. He never moved. His eyes remained fixed on the polished stone in front of him, where a simple bouquet of white lilies rested beneath an engraved family name. There were no photographers, no bodyguards standing nearby, no expensive cars waiting with engines running. Just silence. Something about that silence felt heavier than the rain. I could have kept walking like everyone else. Instead, I slowed down. My grandmother used to tell me that grief looked lonelier when people were afraid to interrupt it. I never forgot those words. When I reached him, I stopped just long enough to lift my umbrella over both of us. He looked at me for the first time. His blue eyes were impossibly calm, yet there was a sadness buried so deep that it almost disappeared behind years of discipline. "You will get wet," he said quietly. His voice was steady, almost distant. I smiled without thinking. "So will you." He glanced toward the umbrella before looking back at the memorial. "Rain does not bother me." "Maybe not," I answered softly. "But standing alone always does." For a brief second, something changed in his expression. Not a smile. Not surprise. Just the smallest crack in a wall that had clearly taken years to build. Then he stepped backward, leaving the shelter of the umbrella. "Keep it," he said. "You need it more than I do." Before I could respond, he turned and walked into the rain without another word. His black suit disappeared through the mist until only the echo of his footsteps remained. I stood there holding the umbrella, wondering why a complete stranger had left me feeling as though I had just watched someone carry an invisible weight too heavy for anyone else to see. The next morning, I found a single white lily resting on the front steps of my apartment with no note, no signature, and no explanation. Somehow, I already knew exactly who had left it there. The white lily remained on my kitchen table for 3 days before I finally stopped wondering whether I had imagined the man who left it there. Every morning before leaving for school, I found myself looking at its delicate petals as though they carried an answer I had not learned how to read. Life, however, refused to pause for unanswered questions. My classroom was filled with 8-year-olds who believed every problem could be solved with enough crayons, kindness, and imagination. Their laughter had a way of pulling me back into the present. By the time the final school bell rang each afternoon, the strange encounter in the rain almost felt like a dream. Almost. On Friday evening, I stopped by the neighborhood bookstore before walking toward my favorite coffee shop. The air had turned colder, and the streets of downtown Chicago glowed beneath early sunset. As I reached the crosswalk, I noticed an elderly man struggling with several grocery bags while trying to steady himself against the curb. Without thinking, I hurried over and gathered the bags before they slipped from his hands. He smiled with quiet relief. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said. "These old knees are not what they used to be." I walked him safely across the street and waited until he disappeared into a nearby apartment building. When I turned around, I saw the same black sedan parked across the avenue. It looked familiar, but before I could study it more closely, the traffic began moving again. I shrugged it off and continued toward the coffee shop. Inside, the warm scent of cinnamon and fresh espresso wrapped around me like a blanket. I ordered my usual drink, reached for my wallet, and frowned when the cashier smiled. "The gentleman before you already paid." I looked over my shoulder, expecting to find someone waving. The shop was nearly empty. "Did he leave a name?" I asked. She shook her head. "No. He only asked us to make sure you smiled today." I stepped outside holding the warm paper cup, scanning both directions of the street. The black sedan was gone. The only thing left behind was the strange feeling that someone had quietly stepped into my life without asking permission. Over the next several days, little things continued happening. A broken porch light outside my apartment was mysteriously repaired before the landlord even answered my request. A stack of classroom books I had wanted for months arrived anonymously at school with a simple note that read, "For curious minds." My aging car, which had been making an awful rattling sound for weeks, suddenly ran perfectly after the mechanic informed me that an anonymous customer had already covered the repair bill. None of it felt flashy. None of it demanded gratitude. Whoever was responsible never appeared to collect appreciation. One rainy evening, as I locked the classroom door, I glanced across the empty parking lot and saw him again. Adrian stood beneath a street lamp wearing the same calm expression I remembered from the memorial. He did not wave. He did not approach. He simply looked at me for one quiet moment before turning away and disappearing into the falling rain once more, leaving me with the unmistakable feeling that our story had only just begun. After that evening, I stopped trying to convince myself the mysterious encounters were nothing more than coincidence. There was a pattern now, quiet enough to escape everyone else, but impossible for me to ignore. Adrian never interrupted my life. He simply appeared around the edges of it like a shadow that carried no fear. A week later, our school hosted its annual fall fundraiser at a neighborhood community center. Parents, teachers, local businesses, and volunteers filled the building with laughter, homemade desserts, and handmade decorations created by the children. I spent most of the afternoon helping my students arrange artwork along the walls while families wandered from table to table. It was the kind of ordinary day I loved most. Just before the charity auction began, one of the organizers rushed toward me with wide eyes. "Emily, we have an anonymous donor," she whispered excitedly. "Someone covered the entire renovation for the school library." I stared at her, certain I had misunderstood. "The whole renovation?" She nodded. "New shelves, new computers, reading corners, everything." Applause spread through the room as the principal announced the unexpected gift, thanking the unnamed donor for believing in the future of every child inside the school. No name was mentioned. No company accepted recognition. Whoever had made the donation had specifically requested complete privacy. Hours later, after helping clean the last folding tables, I stepped outside into the cool evening air. Across the street stood the familiar black sedan. This time the rear passenger door remained open. Adrian stepped onto the sidewalk, dressed in another perfectly tailored dark suit, his expression as composed as ever. Before I could decide whether to walk away or toward him, he spoke first. "How was the fundraiser?" I folded my arms, studying him carefully. "Successful, thanks to someone who does not seem to enjoy receiving credit." The smallest smile touched the corner of his mouth. Children should never lose opportunities because adults are proud. I looked directly into his blue eyes. "Was it you?" He remained silent for several seconds before answering. "Does it matter?" I laughed softly. "It matters if I am trying to thank someone." He shook his head almost imperceptibly, then thanked the children for giving people something worth believing in. His answer lingered between us. It was impossible to tell whether he was avoiding the truth or protecting it. "Who are you really?" I asked quietly. Adrian looked toward the community center where the final lights were being switched off, one classroom at a time. "Someone who learned a long time ago that doing the right thing becomes less meaningful when you expect applause afterward." Before I could ask another question, several neighborhood children burst through the front doors, laughing as they chased one another across the sidewalk. Adrian immediately stepped aside to give them room. One little girl carrying a stack of picture books stumbled slightly. Without hesitation, he bent down, caught the books before they hit the pavement, and handed them back with a gentle smile that looked entirely different from the guarded expression he wore around adults. The little girl thanked him before running after her friends, never realizing who he was. I watched the entire moment in silence. The man everyone seemed to avoid had just revealed more kindness in 10 quiet seconds than most people managed in an entire lifetime. And for the first time since meeting him, I found myself wondering whether the coldness everyone saw was simply the armor protecting a heart that had been carrying invisible scars for far too long. The image of Adrian kneeling to hand those books back to a little girl stayed with me far longer than it should have. It did not match the quiet mystery surrounding him, and it certainly did not match the whispers I occasionally overheard whenever someone recognized his last name. During the following week, curiosity slowly replaced uncertainty. I found myself noticing every article left behind in coffee shops, every magazine headline in grocery store checkout lines, every passing conversation that mentioned the DeLuca family. Most stories focused on business achievements, charitable foundations, and influential investments across Chicago. Others hinted at a powerful family that valued privacy above everything else. None of them explained the sadness I had seen in Adrian's eyes on that rainy night beside the memorial. One Saturday afternoon, after finishing errands, I wandered into the Chicago Botanical Conservatory to escape the chilly wind. The greenhouse was warm, filled with soft sunlight filtering through glass panels covered with tiny drops of condensation. The scent of fresh earth and blooming orchids surrounded every winding path. I had barely stepped inside when I heard a familiar voice behind me. I wondered if you like quiet places. I turned and found Adrian standing a few feet away, dressed far more casually than I had ever seen him before. A charcoal sweater had replaced the tailored suits, making him look less like an untouchable businessman and more like an ordinary man who had finally allowed himself to breathe. "Are you following me?" I asked with a teasing smile. He shook his head. "No, but I hope we might eventually choose the same destination." We walked slowly through the greenhouse without rushing to fill the silence. Surprisingly, it never felt uncomfortable. Every few minutes Adrian paused to admire a flower or read the small information plaques beside rare plants. It was impossible not to notice how carefully he observed everything around him. Eventually we reached a quiet corner where a wooden bench overlooked a garden filled with white lilies. Adrian stopped walking. His expression changed almost instantly. He looked younger somehow, but also far more vulnerable. "My mother loved lilies," he said softly. "Every spring she planted more than she had room for." I remained silent, sensing that this was not a moment meant to be interrupted. He looked down at his hands before continuing. "She believed beautiful things should never be measured by how practical they were." A faint smile appeared before fading again. "When I was 12 years old, she became very sick. I kept believing she would come home because everyone kept telling me to stay hopeful." His voice remained calm, yet every word carried years of carefully hidden grief. She never did. The greenhouse seemed impossibly still around us. Even the distant conversations of other visitors faded into the background. I did not search for comforting words because none would have been enough. Instead, I quietly sat beside him on the bench. After several minutes, I reached into my bag, removed the folded umbrella I always carried, and rested it between us with a gentle smile. "You know," I said softly, "sometimes people do not need someone to fix the rain. They only need someone willing to stay through it." Adrian looked at me for a long moment, and for the first time since we met, the walls around his heart did not crack. They simply became transparent enough for me to see the lonely boy who had been hiding behind them all along. The conversation in the greenhouse changed something neither of us was ready to name. We did not suddenly become inseparable, and we certainly did not begin sharing every detail of our lives. Instead, we settled into something quieter. We started meeting for coffee on Saturday mornings, taking slow walks along the Chicago River after my workdays, and discovering that silence felt surprisingly comfortable when we shared it together. Adrian never tried to impress me with expensive restaurants or extravagant gifts. He listened more than he spoke, and somehow that meant more than any grand gesture ever could. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, everything shifted because of a misunderstanding so small it almost seemed impossible. I had stayed late at school helping one of my students prepare for a reading competition. By the time I finally checked my phone, I realized I had missed 3 calls from Adrian. Before I could return them, my principal asked if I could drive a fellow teacher home because her car would not start. We stopped for dinner afterward at a small family diner while waiting for roadside assistance. I did not think twice about it. Hours later, I returned home exhausted and found my apartment unusually quiet. The white lily on my kitchen table had begun to fade, reminding me how quickly beautiful things could disappear if they were left unattended. I called Adrian immediately. The phone rang several times before reaching voicemail. That had never happened before. The next morning, I stopped by the coffee shop where we usually met. His favorite table near the window was empty. The barista smiled apologetically. "He came by early," she said. "He only stayed a minute." A strange heaviness settled over me. For the first time since meeting him, I realized how easily 2 people could drift apart simply because neither wanted to admit they were afraid. I did not spend the day wondering what message to send or what perfect words might fix everything. Instead, before sunrise the following morning, I carried 2 cups of coffee from our favorite cafe and drove to the address Adrian had quietly shared with me weeks earlier. The estate looked exactly as I expected, elegant without trying to prove it. The gates opened before I even reached the intercom, as though someone had already been watching. Adrian stood on the front porch wearing a dark sweater instead of a suit, surprise replacing his usual calm expression. He looked tired, as though he had not slept much. I walked up the steps and handed him one of the warm paper cups. "You disappeared," I said gently. He lowered his eyes for a moment. "I thought you had chosen someone else's company." I laughed softly, unable to hide my disbelief. "I drove a co-worker home after school." He remained silent. "Adrian," I continued, "if I ever decide to leave, I will tell you. I will never make you guess." He looked at me as though no one had ever offered him something so simple and so honest. The morning air was cold enough for our breath to drift between us like little clouds, yet neither of us moved. Finally, he accepted the coffee with both hands. "People usually leave without saying goodbye," he admitted quietly. I smiled and took a small sip from my own cup. "Then maybe it is time someone stayed long enough to change your expectations instead of confirming them." For the first time, he did not look like a man preparing to lose someone. He looked like a man beginning to believe that not every goodbye had already been written. After that morning on the front porch, something inside Adrian became noticeably lighter, although he would never have admitted it out loud. The guarded distance he had carried like a second skin slowly gave way to quiet honesty. We still lived separate lives, but those lives began finding one another naturally. Some evenings he would meet me outside the school with 2 cups of hot chocolate instead of coffee, because he remembered I preferred it once the weather turned cold. Other days I would bring homemade soup to his office after learning he had skipped lunch again. There was nothing dramatic about the way we cared for each other. It happened through ordinary moments that somehow became unforgettable. One Friday evening, Adrian invited me to a charity gala benefiting children's hospitals across Illinois. I almost declined because elegant events had never been my world, but he smiled in that gentle way I had come to recognize. "Come exactly as yourself," he said. "That is the only person I want beside me." The ballroom overlooked the Chicago skyline, where thousands of lights reflected across Lake Michigan like scattered stars. Business leaders, community organizers, and philanthropists filled the room with polite conversations and formal smiles. Adrian greeted every guest with calm confidence, yet I noticed something different. Instead of constantly watching the room, his attention kept returning to me as though making certain I felt comfortable. During dinner, an older gentleman approached our table. His silver hair and commanding posture suggested decades of influence. "Adrian," he said evenly, "your family has expectations." Adrian stood politely. "Good evening, Uncle Vincent." The older man acknowledged me with a courteous nod before looking back at Adrian. "There are responsibilities that should remain your priority." His words were respectful, but the meaning beneath them was unmistakable. I was not part of the future his family had imagined. Adrian answered without raising his voice. "My responsibilities have not changed." "Your judgment has," his uncle replied. A quiet silence settled between them before Adrian spoke again. "For the first time in many years, I believe it has improved." His uncle studied him for several seconds, then offered a brief farewell and disappeared into the crowd. I looked at Adrian once we were alone again. "I hope I did not create problems for you." He shook his head immediately. "No, Emily. The problems existed long before you. You simply helped me recognize that I no longer wanted to live according to someone else's definition of success." Later that evening, the auction raised enough money to fund several pediatric treatment programs, and the room erupted into applause. Adrian had quietly contributed more than anyone else, yet he refused public recognition exactly as he always had. As we stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, the city shimmered beneath the night sky. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets and looked across the skyline with thoughtful eyes. "My family built everything by teaching me to control every outcome," he said softly. "Then you walked into my life carrying nothing but an umbrella, and somehow you changed everything without trying to control a single thing." I smiled as we began walking side by side along the quiet sidewalk. For the first time since meeting him, I realized Adrian was no longer choosing between the expectations of his family and the life he truly wanted. He had already made his decision, and with every quiet step beside me, he was learning what freedom actually felt like. Winter arrived quietly, covering Chicago with crisp mornings and streets lined with bare trees that reached toward pale gray skies. Life continued with a comforting rhythm that I had almost forgotten was possible. My weekdays belonged to my students, whose excitement over the approaching holidays filled every classroom with handmade decorations and uneven paper snowflakes. My evenings often belonged to Adrian. Sometimes we walked through neighborhood Christmas markets with steaming cups of hot chocolate warming our hands. Other nights, we simply sat in silence at the conservatory after it closed to most visitors, watching the lights reflect across the glass ceiling while tropical plants flourished beneath the warmth. The more time we spent together, the more I realized Adrian was not becoming someone different. He was becoming someone he had hidden for years. One afternoon, he invited me to visit a building on the north side of the city. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary brick structure undergoing renovations. Inside, however, volunteers moved through freshly painted hallways carrying books, furniture, and boxes of school supplies. Children's artwork already decorated several walls. Adrian watched them with quiet satisfaction. "What is this place?" I asked. He smiled gently. "It will become a community learning center. Free. Tutoring, after-school programs, counseling, and career workshops. Anyone who needs a chance will find one here." I turned toward him with genuine surprise. "You planned all of this?" He nodded. "For months. Why did you never tell me?" He looked around the room before answering. "Because I wanted it to exist for the people who needed it, not for the recognition it might bring me." As volunteers continued arranging classrooms, I noticed a framed architectural drawing resting against one wall. At the bottom, beneath the project title, a small dedication had been handwritten. "In loving memory of Isabella DeLuca." I looked back at Adrian without speaking. My mother believed every child deserved someone who believed in them before they learned to believe in themselves, he said quietly. "I could not save her, but perhaps I can honor what she spent her life teaching me." My chest tightened as I realized this was never about money, influence, or reputation. It was about keeping a promise to someone he had loved long before I entered his life. A few days later, the Learning Center officially opened. There were no television cameras and no elaborate ceremony. Families simply walked through the front doors, greeted by volunteers offering warm smiles and hot cocoa. I spent the afternoon reading picture books to a group of excited children while Adrian assembled shelves in another room with his jacket rolled up and sawdust on his sleeves. Watching him laugh with a little boy who proudly showed him a drawing of a rocket ship felt strangely miraculous. This was the same man I had first met standing alone in the rain, convinced that isolation was safer than hope. As the last families left that evening, we stepped outside beneath a sky filled with gently falling snow. Adrian looked at the lights glowing through the Learning Center windows before quietly reaching for my hand. It was the first time he had done so without hesitation. His fingers were cold from working all afternoon, but his grip was steady. In that simple moment, I understood something that had taken him years to discover. Strength was never measured by how much power a person could hold. It was measured by how much kindness they were finally willing to share. By the time spring returned to Chicago, it felt as though the city had quietly decided to begin again, and somehow Adrian had done the same. The man who once carried every responsibility alone now trusted other people to walk beside him. He delegated more decisions at work, spent fewer nights inside conference rooms, and more afternoons at the Community Learning Center where children greeted him by name instead of title. One Saturday morning, he invited me to breakfast at a small cafe overlooking the river. The sunlight reflected across the water, and for the first time since I had known him, there was no trace of exhaustion in his eyes. After we finished eating, he placed a thin folder on the table between us. "I want you to see something," he said. Inside were legal documents, architectural plans, and letters that had already been signed. I looked up in confusion. "What is all of this?" He leaned back with the calm confidence I had come to admire. "The Learning Center is becoming an independent foundation. It will continue serving families no matter who leads my business in the future." I turned another page and froze when I saw a familiar name. Isabella DeLuca Foundation. My eyes lifted toward him. "You really did it." He smiled softly. "She spent her life believing people deserved second chances. I spent years believing second chances did not exist. I think she was right." I noticed another document beneath the first. It transferred much of the daily management of his family's business to Uncle Vincent and an experienced executive team. I looked at him carefully. This is a huge decision. He nodded. It is. Are you certain? He took a slow breath before answering. For years I believed I had inherited a life that could never change. Then I met someone who carried an umbrella into a storm instead of running away from it. She never asked me to become someone else. She simply reminded me of the person I had buried beneath fear. His words settled quietly between us. I reached across the table and gently covered his hand with mine. You made these choices, I whispered. I only stayed long enough for you to believe you could. Later that afternoon, we visited the conservatory where everything had changed months before. The white lilies were blooming again beneath the glass ceiling, brighter than I remembered. Adrian stopped beside the same wooden bench where he had first spoken about his mother. He looked around with a peaceful expression that had once seemed impossible. I used to come here because it reminded me of everything I had lost, he admitted. Now it reminds me that love does not disappear. Sometimes it simply changes the way it stays with us. We remained there until the late afternoon sunlight painted golden reflections across the greenhouse windows. As we prepared to leave, Adrian gently picked up a fallen white lily petal resting on the bench. He did not keep it. Instead, he placed it back among the flowers where it belonged. Watching that simple gesture, I realized he was no longer holding on to the past out of grief. He was honoring it with gratitude. The man who once believed every goodbye lasted forever had finally discovered that healing was not forgetting where you came from. It was finding the courage to build a future without allowing yesterday to decide who you would become tomorrow. Summer arrived with long evenings, warm breezes drifting across Lake Michigan, and the quiet confidence that life no longer needed to rush toward tomorrow. The Community Learning Center had become part of our weekly routine. Children raced through its hallways carrying books, art projects, and dreams that suddenly felt possible. Adrian no longer walked through those doors as a distant benefactor. He walked in carrying boxes of supplies, fixing loose shelves, reading stories aloud, and listening to every child who wanted to tell him about a science project or a baseball game. Sometimes I would stand in the doorway after finishing my own reading class and simply watch him laugh. It still amazed me how naturally joy had found its way back into a man who once believed it had no place in his life. One Saturday evening, Adrian invited me to the conservatory one more time. The greenhouse glowed beneath the golden light of sunset, and the white lilies were in full bloom. We followed the familiar path until we reached the wooden bench where so many quiet conversations had changed us both. Neither of us spoke for several moments. The silence felt complete instead of empty. Adrian reached into the pocket of his light jacket, and for an instant I wondered whether he was about to take out a small velvet box like every romantic movie I had ever seen. Instead, he smiled and placed a single polished brass key in the palm of my hand. I looked at it with quiet confusion. "This is the front door key to my home," he said softly. "Not because I want you to visit, because I want you to belong there whenever you choose." My eyes lifted to meet his. "There is no ring," I whispered with a gentle laugh. He smiled in return. I thought about buying one. Then I realized a ring can promise a future, but a key says you are already trusted with my present. Emotion caught in my throat as I closed my fingers around the warm piece of brass. He took one careful step closer. "Emily, before I met you, I believed love demanded perfection, and perfection always disappeared. You never tried to rescue me. You never tried to change me. You simply stayed when it would have been easier to walk away. Because of you, I stopped measuring my life by power and started measuring it by peace." Tears filled my eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming simplicity of his words. "I never needed a different man," I answered quietly. "I only hoped the real one would stop hiding." He laughed softly, the sound warm and genuine, before wrapping both of his hands around mine. The evening breeze carried the gentle fragrance of lilies through the greenhouse as sunlight faded into the colors of dusk. Months later, our wedding reflected everything we had become together. It was held in the garden beside the learning center, surrounded by children, teachers, volunteers, friends, and family whose smiles meant more than any grand ballroom ever could. White lilies lined the pathway, honoring the woman whose love had first shaped Adrian's heart and the journey that had led us both there. As we walked away hand in hand beneath a sky glowing with the last light of sunset, I realized love had never arrived with dramatic declarations or impossible promises. It had appeared quietly, carrying an umbrella into the rain, offering a single flower without expecting thanks, choosing to stay through ordinary days until two strangers became each other's safest place. Some people believe hearts change because time passes. I believe they change because one kind soul refuses to stop believing there is still goodness waiting behind the walls another person has spent a lifetime building.